It's my pleasure to introduce our poet tonight. Very appreciative of having Clem Stark, be our reader. If you saw the invitation, he's had quite a history. He says he's a Princeton dropout and a former merchant. So we have a hand here. And a former merchant seaman. He has worked at many jobs, but mostly as a carpenter and construction foreman on the West Coast, San Francisco, British Columbia, Oregon. His first book of poems, Journeyman's Wages, received the 1996 Oregon Book Award, as well as the William Stafford Memorial Poetry Award from the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association. His next two books, Studying Russian on Company Time, which is 99, and China Basin 2002, were also finalists for the Oregon Book Award. Traveling Incognito, a letterpress chapbook from Woodworks in Seattle, appeared in 2004. And a new book, he has a new book out, Rembrandt Chainsaw, publication fall of 2011, which is now. So he lives on some 40 acres out in the country outside of Dallas, Oregon, in the mid-Willamette Valley. Would you join me in welcoming to the poetry series our poet tonight, Clem Stark. Clem.
So I'm going to read mostly from this new book. Try some of these poems out. Actually, this book has been in the works for a while. So these are not brand new poems. So as Tom mentioned, I live in the country, 40-some acres, south of Dallas, and I like space around me. But I do have some neighbors, a quarter of a mile away. So I'm going to start out by reading a poem, the first poem from the new book. It's called Neighbors. New neighbors, building a house up on the hill. She raises goats, he works at the pen. From my back door, it's 30 miles as the crow flies over the mountains to the coast. It used to be, I could imagine walking it, unimpeded. No fences, nothing but deer trails and logging roads. Now I'm surrounded by neighbors. Which is better? Seeking the recluse in the mountains and finding he's not at home? Or helping the goat lady rig up a new wooden pedestal for our mailboxes? I'm a great admirer of Chinese poetry, and in Chinese poetry there's many leitmotifs that you can find over the centuries in various poets. And one of them is the speaker, the poet, has gone off into the mountains seeking a guru, seeking the master, and finding he's not at home. So he goes back to where he started. It's a shaggy dog story, or a Zen story. So I had worked as a carpenter, made my living as a carpenter for most of 40-some years. I got started in the early 60s in San Francisco, went through the apprenticeship program. And one of the things apprentice carpenters did in those days was to build a scaffold, wooden scaffold. Nowadays, mostly scaffolding is pipe frame systems that are brought in on a truck and assembled. But we learned to build scaffold, wooden scaffold. So this next poem is called Building Scaffold. This is how we built scaffold, the old-timer says, driving a screw with his cordless drill. Except we didn't use screws or cordless drills. Things change. Hardly a carpenter nowadays uses a handsaw. The folding rule has gone the way of the dodo, and even hammers may soon be relegated to antiques and collectibles. A scaffold, however, is temporary by definition, a minimal structure intended to be torn down, a kind of medieval siege tower, or a makeshift platform from which to contemplate impermanence. As the old-timer says, it will put you in places where no one has ever been. True. I always used to have that sense of, being up in the air 30 feet or so and realizing no human being has ever occupied this space before. I'm the first one. So I am a college Princeton dropout. I set out for I don't know, whatever a 17 or 18-year-old sets out for, adventure, something different from an academic life, academic career. I had met a guy hitchhiking to college. This was back in the 50s. Who was a merchant seaman, an ex-seaman, and he convinced me that that's what I should do. I should go to sea. So I set out trying to catch a ship. Hitchhiked down the East Coast. Wound up getting seaman's papers in Mobile, Alabama, and then staying for quite some time in New Orleans, trying to utilize my newly acquired seaman's papers. But shipping was tied up in the Gulf ports then, and so I never wound up going to sea until a number of years later. But I spent a lot of time in New Orleans, and that's where this next poem comes from. It starts out with a present tense, but the story is basically from a time in New Orleans. It's called The Girl from Panama. I'm talking with Mike over coffee. His wife recently left him. He's lonely. We're both carpenters, a couple of old guys in baseball caps plying the trade. We can frame a wall and hang a door. We can read a set of blueprints. But when it comes to women, I'm thinking about my mother, who is 91 and very frail. I'm thinking about my wife, my daughters, my granddaughter, my sister, old girlfriends, my ex-wife, and the girl from Panama in the reading room of the New Orleans Public Library 45 years ago, who slipped a note to me across the table asking, "Are you a philosophy?" Rain splatters against the storefront of the coffee shop. Mike and I are silent for a long time before going back to work. So working on jobs, construction jobs as I have, you work with a crew, and then the job is over and the crew disperses, and chances are that you'll never see most of these guys again. But from time to time you run into one in a totally different context. In case a Safeway or somewhere, shopping mall or something. And it's hard, you have to do a double take because you don't recognize them out of context. So this next poem describes such an encounter. It's called Gadsky, Elk Hunting. In the checkout line at Safeway, I run into Gadsky, a guy I worked with once on a job somewhere in Woodburn or McMinnville. So we exchange a little manly bullshit. Then Gadsky begins bending my ear with an account of his elk hunting exploits. Halfway across the parking lot, about when we get to where Gadsky is crouching in the salal, having just spotted a 6 or 7 point bull, my attention lapses. I drift and imagine myself in a coffee house in Caracas, where a gaggle of bearded poets argues vociferously over just what it is that distinguishes verse from prose. But what job did I work on with Gadsky? Well, whatever it was, Gadsky and I have it in common. It distinguishes us. Gadsky. So, actually, this is the most in the new book. This is the most recent poem. It comes from a couple of years ago. I don't know how hard you were hit up here in Portland. Not as badly as we were in the Mid-Willamette Valley by an ice storm just before Christmas in December of '08. It really wiped out the oak trees around our house, just decimated them. It was catastrophic almost. I've been spending the next 2 years cutting firewood from the oaks that came down. Big, huge branches snapped like pretzels. So anyway, I wound up writing this poem out of that experience. It's called "It Could Be Worse." Call it sleet or call it snow. It's coming down so hard it's hard to see the two linemen up there at the crossarm of the pole. They're working from the bucket of their boom truck with come-alongs and tackle to retrieve our downed power lines and reattach us to the grid. 4 days without power after an early winter storm savaged the countryside. Out all day with a chainsaw, clearing limbs and broken trees from the right-of-way. I'm standing in the snow now with the line crew foreman, peering up, remembering days like this on a construction site when I wished I'd become a librarian. It's cold, it's getting dark, I'm soaking wet. The sleet has turned to freezing rain. Some fucking weather, I say to the guy, over the roar of the truck's diesel. And he replies, "It could be worse. You could be sitting at a fucking desk 8 hours a day, 5 days a week." Couldn't believe it. So after I had been working, I worked out of the Union Hall first in San Francisco, and then I built custom homes for a while up in British Columbia. Came down here in '76 and put my book into the Salem Carpenters Local. Worked out of it for 10 or 12 years. And I was having to travel further and further afield for work. I was driving to Portland some days, an hour and a half commute, one way. I decided that was too much, cutting into my life. So I applied for a state job, a job as a carpenter with the state. And after, a year and a half or so, I finally got a call and wound up going to work at Oregon State University in the physical plant at OSU. We're doing maintenance and repair work. There were a crew of, at that time when I first started, there were seven carpenters that worked at OSU. So this is called maintenance and repair. I'm showing the new guy how to replace the spring-loaded pressure shoes on an aluminum hopper window. It doesn't require an engineering degree, but like a lot of simple things, tying your shoelaces, for example, or marriage. It's tricky. This is my last week of work before retiring. I'm being replaced. Maintenance and repair will continue without me. Every day, minute by minute, things are wearing out and breaking down. Window hardware and body parts. Language itself. I'm rehearsing the speech I plan to give at my retirement party. Boys, I'll say to my trusty confreres, remember, adjusting the spring tension on one or the other, or both, of the nylon pressure shoes is essential to proper operation. So I mentioned earlier how I had set out trying to catch a ship after I dropped out of school, and wound up eventually sailing off the West Coast with the Seafarers International Union. This was in the late 60s. And what we were doing was most of the ships I sailed on was hauling war material to the war in Vietnam. So here's a group of three poems. It's called Three Sea Stories. The first one here in Oregon, on the Oregon coast, it's just called On a Freighter Leaving Newport. 37 degrees on the inclinometer. Crossing the bar, that old Victory ship rolled so far over on her side, the pilot, a portly man, climbing down a rope ladder to the launch that would take him ashore, looked like a crab scuttling backwards, a tiny figure on a huge teeter-totter. But the ship righted itself. It righted itself. The pilot leaped aboard his launch, and we proceeded south along the coast, 1,000 miles, Yaquina Bay to Port Hueneme, to top off our cargo before heading out again across open water to the war in Southeast Asia. This one's called Saga of the Goodwill. Goodwill, name of a ship, which is described in the poem. Fore and aft rigged, a two-masted schooner. Overall length, 161 feet. Built in the 20s as a private yacht. Largest fore and aft rigged sailing vessel in the world, we were told, in 1968. A group of us, as part of a lunatic scheme, had made an offer to purchase her. We knew next to nothing about sailing, but planned to make seamanship a kind of spiritual discipline. After a nearly disastrous trial voyage from Honolulu to San Francisco, we had her hauled out for inspection. It turned out that the steel hull was so badly rusted in places you could almost poke a screwdriver through it. So the deal was off. And 6 months later, when she went down with all hands in a storm off Ensenada, we were not aboard. Here's the last of these three sea stories. This one begins with a quotation from a song that some of you may know, Canadian folk singer Stan Rogers, a song called The Genie Sea. The poem is called On the Beach. And on the beach in seaman's lingo means not at sea. You can be on the beach in Kansas City, but it means that you're not at sea. There are only two states of being for a seaman, either at sea or on the beach. I'll go to sea no more, is what I'm thinking, remembering the words of the song while listening to waves crash on the beach. I'm in a motel on the Oregon coast. It's midnight, full moon, January of my 66th year. The way the song goes, a man, his son, and a hired hand set out for the Grand Banks to fish for cod in a boat built by the man's father. What it was she struck, they never knew, but suddenly every seam poured water. I've been to sea. I have a son, and you could say my life is a boat built by my father. So after I'd been to sea for a year or so, and I went back to Brooklyn to go through what's called lifeboat certification in order to get my able-bodied seaman's document. And a photograph was taken of the bunch of us young seamen. I guess I was probably the oldest because I think I was in my early 30s or just about 30. Anyway, I had totally forgotten that photograph and was going through a box of old memorabilia at one point, and I came across the photograph, and adjacent to it in the collection was another photograph. So this is simply called two photographs. In this group photograph, I'm standing, back row, center, one of a gang of 11 young orangutans in identical T-shirts reading Seafarers International Union, AFL-CIO. A sign in the foreground, Lifeboat Certification Class, 1967. For over a week, every morning, we've been rowing a lifeboat back and forth on the icy waters of Sheepshead Bay, preparing ourselves to qualify as able-bodied seamen. Another photograph showing what could be the lifeboat class 30 years later. A bunch of amiable, aging, overweight apes is actually the maintenance crew at a large university. I'm on the left, standing, facing the camera. So here's a couple of older poems. All those poems that I've read so far are from the new book. These are from a previous book that I would read tonight. When I was working at OSU, I eventually became the door expert, the door man on campus. And I was told that there were 22,000 doors on the Oregon State University campus. And about half of those were in another department, the department that dealt with the dormitories. But I was more or less responsible for about 11,000 doors. So I got to know intimately some things about doors that you may not know. So this is an educational poem. One of the features of doors in any public facility is a device called a door closer. You probably know that you don't have to close the door yourself. The door closes itself. And what closes it is the door closer. So here is a brief lecture on door closers. Although heretofore unconsidered in verse or in song, the ordinary door closer is I submit, a device well worth considering, consisting primarily of a spring and a piston in combination. Here's how it works. You open a door, either pushing or pulling. The spring is compressed, the piston extended. Now, having passed through the doorway, you relinquish control, and the door closer takes over. The spring remembers how it was. It wants to return, but the urge is damped by the resistance the piston encounters, snug in its cylinder filled with hydraulic fluid. Such is the mechanism of the door closer, invented in 1876 by Charles Norton, when a slamming door in a courtroom in Cincinnati repeatedly disrupted the administration of justice. Whether concealed beneath the threshold or overhead in the head jamb, whether surface mounted as a parallel arm installation or as a regular arm, door closers are ever vigilant, silently performing their function, rarely complaining. Whereas doors can be metaphorical, as in, for example, he could never unlock the door to her heart. Door closers cannot. Remember this when you pass through and the door closes behind you with a soft thud and final click as the latch bolt engages the strike. So that was a challenge, that you can write a poem about anything, even door closers. So this next one's a little sort of a fantasy, I guess. It's a construction poem, but a fantastic poem. One of the great 20th century poets whose work I admire is the great German poet Rainer Maria Rilke. So, as much as I admire his poetry, I never could feel much sympathy for Rilke as a person, which somehow lived diametrically opposite to me in terms of being a European neurasthenic aesthete. So this basically is a revenge poem. It's called Rainer Maria Rilke Goes Construction. I try to imagine Rilke showing up for work one morning on the construction site, his sad, dark eyes and drooping mustache conspicuous under the yellow hard hat. Not to mention the angels accompanying him. That's the new laborer, somebody says. He can't hardly speak English, says somebody else. And then, as if on cue, all the bosses I've ever worked for merge and descend on him in a cyclone of animadversion. Angels scatter like dandelion fluff. Rilke is visibly shaken. I can see the poor bastard doesn't know which end is up, and so I take him aside, and in a friendly way I say, Rainer, get your ass in gear. We got work to do. Quit fooling with them angels. Or else I take another tack, back off, and ask him something technical, like, what is the sound of a jackhammer breaking up concrete in heaven? He doesn't savvy. But later, at coffee, I ask the other laborers how the new guy is working out. And one of them says affably, "Not bad for a poet." Everybody likes him. I can't get over it. He's just like one of us, the plumber foreman tells me once. They call him the Dutchman, or just plain Kraut, as in, "Hey, Kraut, get us some 8-foot 2x4s, will you?" At night, he hits the bars, and I hear stories how the women really go for him. His accent, his sensitivity. The upshot of it is, in this scenario, Rilke goes on to great success as a construction super. I drop out, get steady work fixing doors, mending broken windows, healing the wounds in buildings. Now and then, I get a letter. He always asks, "What is the sound of a jackhammer breaking up concrete?" So this next poem is another job that I worked on once. When I was, after the time I told you that I spent in New Orleans trying to catch a ship, I wound up meeting a guy on Skid Row who taught me about riding the freights. And so I rode the freight trains for a while around the country and wound up, traveled all over the West, and then wound up in Oregon for the first time, and wound up in Eastern Oregon, actually. Although this poem starts out in Portland, as you will recognize. Anyway, we wound up working. He had a connection with somebody, knew a guy, and we wound up working on a section gang. Maintaining 20 miles of railroad track, was the Union Pacific Main Line through the Blue Mountains. So we worked between Pendleton and LeGrand on a 20-mile section of track, an isolated section of track. You couldn't get there by car. You had to either take the train or ride the train or hike down a steep canyon side in order to get to the place where we were working. So that type of work was called Gandhi dancing. Yes. So that's the title of this poem. 2 days on Burnside was enough. We jumped a freight, rode it as far as Pendleton, and took the bus from there. Paul knew a guy in Meacham could get us work on a section gang. Gandhi dancing, tamping ballast under railroad ties, compacting broken rock and gravel, jacking up low spots in the track, while the foreman on his knees eyeballs the rail. We work in pairs, 2 men facing off, driving the 6-foot tamping bars with a flinging motion into the ballast, in sync. In sync, that is, unless your partner happens to be a squat, pudgy, out-of-sync, herky-jerky, hungover Navajo named Charlie. He was just on another wavelength, had another sense of rhythm entirely. So here's another poem from that period of my life when I was bumming around the country, riding the freights and hitchhiking. It's just called Hitchhiking. I was standing by the side of the road somewhere in Idaho, thumbing a ride. I was headed back east. From the map, I could see that the shortest way lay through Wyoming. Hitchhiking was my magic carpet, but it required perseverance and luck. What to do next, I wondered, while pondering schemes that involved Argentina or Iceland and a system for playing the horses. Traffic was sparse and no car stopped. So after 4 hours, I quit, walked back across town, started thumbing again, south this time, toward Utah. Oh, and here's the poem that's on the broadside that was made up for tonight's reading. A little short poem called Otherwise. Stopping off at the Dairy Mart in Harrisburg for a 6-pack of PBR, I reflect on the path my life might have taken had the conjunction of planets been otherwise. All things considered, I could have been the founder of a U-Bake pizza empire, or wound up living with a ditzy blonde and her 2 kids in a trailer park outside Harrisburg. Well, this one is pretty self-explanatory. It's called echocardiogram. With electrodes attached to my chest and wires that lead to a large apparatus resembling a pinball machine, my heart is being monitored. I'm watching it beat on a computer screen. At the same time, I'm thinking about my old Chevy pickup. 48 years since it rolled off the assembly line. I'm exactly 20 years older than that. No wonder the valves are worn. The kid who's handling the equipment is called an echo tech. He learned how to do it at school in Spokane. With my golden years in jeopardy, it's time to ask some questions. What do you make of those old Bolsheviks who confessed to crimes they never committed? Or how about the Wannsee Conference, where finishing touches were put to the final solution? What about global warming? So here's one from times I've spent that all of you are familiar with, driving the interstate. This is called camber. I don't know if you all know that word, camber. Camber is that slight convexity that you can see. One of the ways that you can often see it on the freeway, if you happen to pass a semi or flatbed semi that's empty, no load on it, you'll notice that that bed is actually slightly convex. It has camber to it, so that when it takes weight, it'll straighten out. So if it were straight to begin with, it would sag. Camber. But this is another use of the term in this poem. Observing the underside of freeway overpasses is one way to kill time on the interstate between Portland and Seattle. You don't have to have worked heavy construction, but if you have, you'll know the lingo. Columns, cap and spandrel beams, abutments, soffit, cold joint, barrier rail. Architecturally, even your most imposing freeway overpass is not in the same league with the flying buttresses of a Gothic cathedral. Still, there is something to be said for functional simplicity, the subtlety and grace of camber. So you'll notice that overpasses often, not always, but often, sometimes the camber is actually built in so you don't see it, but because the soffit is flat, but oftentimes you'll see that slight camber. So I'm going to wind this up with some new, are these all new? No, some of them. Here's a new one. This is quite recent, not in the book or anywhere else. Again, it's drawn from a job, construction job I worked on. I told you, worked out of the Union Hall in San Francisco for years. And mostly what union carpenters do is concrete work, building the forms for concrete. So heavy construction, that's the term for it. So this is called riding the high ball. And that will be explained in the poem, what the high ball is. I tried contracting for a while in San Francisco, but my career as an entrepreneur was short-lived, and I went back to work out of the hall, Carpenters Local 483, the Dago local. Right off, the dispatcher sends me out to a job site, says for me to see Frank. Frank says, "Can you work high?" "Sure," I say, bluffing. So I got the job and got to confront every day for over a year my fear of heights. It was a bridge job. To get to where the work was, we either climbed or rode the headache ball, the high ball, like the lead sinker on a fishing line. This was a solid steel, 500-pound, oversized basketball attached directly above the hook on the whip line of a 52-ton truck crane. Grab the cable, sit on the ball, cross your legs, and pucker up, squeezing the cable between your thighs. Then signal the operator and hang on tight, up and away, 60, 80, 100 feet in the air, dangling out over the construction site. "There's no rush like the rush you get from riding the high ball," says my partner, a long-haired druggie, a pilebuck from Oakland, and he should know. Fear and glory, that's what it was. Fear and glory. The kind of job that won't do much for your resume, but after work, you can hang up your tool belt and swagger a little. So here's the last couple of poems. This one is actually the title poem from the new book, Rembrandt Chainsaw, but due to my publisher's insistence on not having a poem in the book with the same title as the title of the book, I changed the title in the book. So in the book it's called Late October, but originally it was called Rembrandt Chainsaw. I'm thinking about Rembrandt while filing a chainsaw that used to belong to my neighbor, Lloyd Cooley, a steel 017 I got at the yard sale after Lloyd died. I'm thinking how Rembrandt, over the course of his lifetime, created nearly 100 self-portraits. And also I'm thinking how one of those pictures of everyday life in Holland in the 17th century might include a carpenter in his workshop filing a saw. Some things don't change. It's late October. Time to reconsider everything. With each stroke of the file, I can feel steel biting steel, leaving each tooth with a razor-sharp edge. And we'll wind this up with this last poem, which is a brand new poem. Haven't read it before, so you're my guinea pigs. It's called Life and Nothing More. I'm ambling along, not watching my step, when all of a sudden I find myself ignominiously sprawled out on the asphalt. I'll be damned if I haven't become a doddering old man. So this is life. Skinned knees, a wife drifting into oblivion, and a body no longer agile enough to recover its equilibrium. But my children are not in jail. The IRS is not after me. And the moon is beautiful tonight, tangled in the power lines outside the convenience store where I've stopped for a can of beer to reflect and to compose this poem. So I guess we're open for questions and talk and whatever you would like to do. I'm open to anything.
Well, I always ask, what's your writing practice?
What is my writing practice? Well, I started out 50 years ago, like anybody else, sitting at a desk and writing, and just very seriously trying to imitate the poets that I admired, the great many 20th century poets particularly. So I did that for many years, in a very conventional way, just applying myself and spending a lot of time at it, reading poetry, and trying to imitate, trying to do what these poets did that moved me. And then, I moved to San Francisco at some point, and then I started giving public readings. And I was a terrible reader. And like most of the other poets that I heard read at that time, they were all pretty bad. It was pretty boring going to a poetry reading. So I somehow resolved that I would not bore an audience. And one of the ways I realized that I could achieve that was by not just looking at the page, but by talking to the audience. So I then acquired the habit, and this became my practice, and is my practice to this day, of composing poems entirely in my head, so that I don't have to read them off the printed page, so that I could talk a poem, I could converse with an audience. So, and that proved very fruitful because, well, not only could I connect more easily with an audience, but it also was a test case of language, of being able to make a distinction between the spoken word and the written word. And so to this day, that's basically, and all these poems that I read tonight were composed totally in my head before I ever wrote them down. And then, of course, it's not 100% because you can do a lot of things with a spoken voice that is not evident on the page when you put the words on the page. I mean, we have all kinds of gestures and inflections, all kinds of innuendos that happen with your body and with your voice when you read, and that's not easily achieved on the page. And being able to communicate all the variety of innuendo and intonation. So after I put a poem, finally I put a poem on the page. Usually I go through about a week of profound depression. And, because it just is not as good as I thought it was when I was saying it to myself. When I say I compose them in my head, that means I'm talking them aloud. When I was working, I'm retired now, but when I was working, my commute to and from work was just constant. I'm just talking to myself, just talking poems, coming up with a line somehow that intrigued me and just starting out with it and seeing where it would go, just repeating it endlessly, dozens, hundreds of times, the line, and then coming up with, it seemed to lead somewhere, and then I'd have 2 lines. And I'd say those 2 lines hundreds of times, and then you'd go on from there. So a long, drawn-out process, an incremental process. So then, as I say, I put it on the page and get kind of down about it because it isn't as good as I thought it was, and then I start working it again, in a more conventional way, working it on the page, But by the time I've finished with a poem, I've spent, usually a couple months at least, and then many versions, many versions until it comes out clean somehow, until it comes out the way I want it. Yes?
Do you, along that same line, before publication, give them to friends for critiques?
Oh, sure.
Or do you do it all on your own?
Well,
Say,
I'm mostly, worked alone, I never attended any kind of workshop or group reading until I came to Oregon. And for a time, I met with a group of people in Corvallis, other poets, and would, pass work around and get interesting feedback from them. But by that time, I had been working for, 15, 20 years, and I had a body of work that had been well worked over. So it was useful to me, but not essentially useful. It was good. But I have a few friends. My good friend who's read here at the Pond House, Charles Goodrich. He's my poetry buddy. He's always usually the first to see whatever I write, and his critique is always acute and good. And so yeah, I do, but mostly it's on my own.
Thank you.
Yes, Maggie.
Well, Clem, you certainly read well from the paper now. And I'm also impressed that you can remember. I do that with haiku, and I repeat them, for 20 minutes, the same haiku, and I go home to write it down, and I've forgotten it. So.
Well, it's practice. It's practice. It's like anything else. It's like learning to throw a baseball and to throw it into what sector of the strike zone you want to throw it in. You know what I mean? It takes practice. It just takes practice, and I think that's the same thing. For me, people say, "Oh, but you like you just said, I forget." I say, "Well, for me, that's good. Then it's not worth remembering. If you forget it, it's not worth remembering." So just remember what's good.
So we learned a lot about other people's lives that we would not normally hear about. Not to mention construction techniques and some of these words, and I'll never close the door again without thinking about your and so I love these stories, how you go into your own life and other people's lives. You're a natural storyteller, and I'm wondering if you've ever written short stories.
Well, I started out with the idea of being a prose writer. Years ago, back in the 50s. My heroes were William Faulkner and other novelists. And that's what I thought I would do, but I had no idea. It was before the days of workshops and the kind of collaborative, the possibilities that exist now. So I just, I really had no idea how to be a writer. That's what I wanted to be a writer, but I had no idea how to be a writer. Well, you have to write, obviously. So first of all, you have to have some material to write about. So I guess that's what I was setting out to do when I was riding freight trains and bumming around the country trying to gather material. So I never really started writing until I was 21. And actually, I had a funny story I can tell. I had a a job one summer between my 2 years of college. I went to Middlebury College in Vermont, the French language school, and then I dropped out of college, wound up working on the railroad and doing all these other things, and I wanted to go back east. I wanted to go to Europe again. I had been to Europe once before, so I wrote to the director of I left out one part of the story. After I finished at the Middlebury French School, I was working as a waiter to pay my tuition. And I learned that they were looking for waiters at this thing called the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, which was nearby. So I didn't know anything about it, but I went there, and there were all these famous writers. I didn't know they were famous, but they were there. And so it was interesting. And so anyway, a few years later, I wrote back to see if I could get a job as a waiter at the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. So I did. They said, "Yeah, come on back." This was John Ciardi. Some of you know that name. Anyway, but so I had, in the meantime, this is 1950, 58, something like that. I had grown a beard, and believe it or not, I had long hair, which was quite unusual in 1958. And so I showed up at John Ciardi's doorstep, and he took one look at me and said, "Oh man, we're going to have trouble with the dietitian. She's not going to want to have you work as a waiter with that beard. It's unsanitary," or whatever. So anyway, he said, we've got some extra money, we'll give you a scholarship. So on my resume, I can say that I had a scholarship to the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. This was before I ever had written a word. Anyway, to finish the story, one of the illustrious writers there that summer was a replacement for Theodore Roethke. Roethke was supposed to have been there. I didn't know who Theodore Roethke was, but anyway, this other guy was there, and he was an Anglo-Irish poet named George Barker. Some of you may know. Anyway, he was really a very acerbic man. He was complete contempt of every other illustrious writer who was there. But he soon learned that I had never written anything, so I was okay. So he kind of he took me under his wing, and well, he asked me at one point, what I had written, and I said, well, I haven't written anything really. I haven't written anything. And so he looked at me and as I say, he was this very nasty man. But he looked at me very kindly, and he said, as if he really were considering my particular situation, and he said, "I think it's time you began." And it was like a light bulb went off. I said, "Oh, okay. So that's how I started writing. But I didn't, as I say, I didn't know how to write a novel, or I didn't know how to write prose, so I thought, well, I'll try a poem. Let's put it on one page. It's easy and simple and small. So that's how I got started, and then I simply became so fascinated with the process. What fascinates me about poems is the miniaturization. It's like a little miniature of a huge thing. It's to me, again, from my childhood, I was a model builder. I built model airplanes and so forth and so on. And I mean, I'm just doing the same thing I did when I was a kid, just making models. I mean, these are all models, just little things, little sculptures of words that have a shape and tell a story, of course.